Hi, everyone. Um, hi, my name is Kadi McKean, and this is Charlie Jones. So if you're in the room to learn about what developers can learn about navigating compliance, you are in the right room. If you are looking for another talk, you are sadly not in the right place. So just want to give everybody that minute to get up if they need it. But it looks like we're staying, so cool. So today we're going to talk about navigating compliance, what developers can learn from driving, and specifically how this can be impactful when you take this in the lens of the Cyber Resilience Act, or CRA. So before we get kicked off, you probably want to know a little bit about who we are. As I said, my name is Kadi McKean. I'm the open source community manager at ReversingLabs. Outside of that, I help run a podcast with a friend named Steve Poole. It's called 10x Insights. So if you have a really good story for open source or just how you've grown professionally, please come see me. We'd love to chat with you. And I'm also a co-organizer of DevOps Days DC.
Awesome. I'm Charlie Jones. I'm a director of product management at ReversingLabs, and I specifically oversee our software supply chain security product called Spectra Assure, which is great because that's exactly the sort of subject matter that we're going to be covering today. So very excited to unpack this topic and what it means to you all in the open source community.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. So a little bit about who ReversingLabs is just before we get started. We're trusted by the top 20% of Fortune 100 companies leading innovative solutions in financial, manufacturing, government, energy, to high-tech organizations. So any type of company you can think of, right? Our threat intelligence powers is the leading cybersecurity in the vendor space, and we're really the largest contributor to the intelligence data for the Open SSF. So if you've looked at their intelligence database on different malware, we are one of the largest contributors to that database. So we have a free resource called secure.software. So if you want to learn more about it, come check us out at our booth. But we have over 6 million packages that we vetted in there for developers to look at, and that can tell you things from, if there's a vulnerability, malware, tampering, secrets being leaked, or hardening issues. So it's a little bit about us. Oh, the slide keeps building. I really should know this one better. Sorry. So getting to the meat and potatoes of today, what we're going to be talking about is who are the key stakeholders in the CRA, really rules of the road and how we're equating this analogy to the CRA, and then key software security requirements as part of that regulation, proactive safety tips, and then if we have time, we'll leave room for a few questions. So I always think it's good. I don't do well speaking when it's just me up here talking alone, so I'd like to make it interactive. So we're going to kick off today with an audience poll. So if you are a maintainer, please raise your hand. Got 1, 2, awesome. What about a software publisher or vendor? Okay, we're seeing some duplicates, fits. What about a software consumer or buyer? Yeah, we're all there, right? And then lastly, what about a steward? No one. Okay, quasi, we'll take it. All right, so I just wanted to level set, and I think this is really a good place to start for today, just to make sure we're all using the same terminology. So I just want to go over quickly what these 4 different roles are in regards to the CRA. So first up, we have manufacturer. What this means is anyone placing software or hardware with digital elements in the EU market. So this includes software vendors, open source distributors, and commercial product companies. These are the people that are responsible for ensuring that their products meet baseline cybersecurity requirements, by design and by default. So completing a conformity assessment, maintaining documentation, and issuing vulnerability disclosures is what they comes down to. So think about it this way. If you ship code that ends up in the consumer's environments, you likely fall into this category. So next up is consumer. And this refers to people or businesses using the software. So think end users, enterprise IT teams, or even small startups that are adopting open source packages. While the CRA doesn't really impose, and Charlie's going to get into this, requirements on consumers directly, it does empower them. So they'll gain more transparency into products within the security posture such as vulnerabilities or secure update mechanisms, right? And we can expect to see this affect procurement and purchasing decisions. So next up is my favorite, is the contributor or maintainer. It's y'all that make the world run round, especially with software nowadays, just based on how much we use open source, so I cannot say thank you enough. But these are the everyday open source developers who are writing code, fixing bugs, maintaining GitHub repos. And under the CRA, if you're contributing to in a non-commercial context, say on your own time without formal product release, you're not considered a manufacturer and you aren't subject to CRA obligations. But once that package is placed in the market, say by a vendor or as part of a product, that's when CRA compliance does kick in. And again, Charlie's going to go over this in way more detail. And lastly, steward. This is one where we had like a quasi hand raising for this one. This is a little bit more nuanced than any of the other key stakeholders here. And a steward is typically an organization like a foundation, like Linux Foundation or even OpenSSF, CNCF, or other nonprofits. And they govern and oversee an open source project's direction without directly selling it. So it's a little nuanced, like I said, but that's the best way to kind of put it all into view. Okay, so this is where Charlie's going to kick in.
Awesome. Okay, so this is, I would say, before we get into the fun stuff, this is the fun stuff for me, as monotonous as it may seem to many of you. What I wanted to start off with is something I call the scope of external influence. And one of the misconceptions that I want to squash is that all software security standards are the same. That's far from the truth. The deeply rooted risk management and compliance purist in me cannot go a day without correcting someone on that notion. So call me overly precise, call me fastidious, call me whatever you want. I do think it's an incredibly important message to get across. And what I want to do today is not have you memorize every single kind of security requirement or best practice that may relate to software security. If we were going to do that, we'd be here for the entirety of the weekend. But instead, I want you all to walk away from here with an understanding of the difference between these types of publications and their impact on the business, so you can confidently navigate a discussion when one gets brought up. So I pulled together, again, a broad spectrum of what I refer to as the scope of external influence. And I've arranged them from kind of your left to right, depending on the level of prescriptive detail that they go into around security. So starting from the left, we have legal. Legal requirements are quite simply those requirements that are issued by a government body that actually hold the force of law. And they often get the highest level of visibility at an organization due to the legal ramifications that they may impose. So it could be fine or imprisonment. So if we take Tim Brown, for example, the CISO of SolarWinds, one of the most notably hacked software manufacturers of all time, he was charged by the SEC with a violation of the Security Exchange Act of 1934 for failure to demonstrate effective internal controls and reporting requirements related to the breach. Now, the charges were actually dropped because it was largely based on hindsight and speculation bias, but you can see that the violation of legal requirements does hold very significant consequences. Next here is regulations. These are requirements issued by a regulatory body and enforceable over a specific sector or region. They're also attract inherently high visibility due to, again, the consequences of not meeting them. So that could be a regulatory fine, a sanction, a revocation of an actual business license, like a banking license for a financial service entity. Still written at quite a high level because regulators don't want to impose any very strict or absolute requirements on organizations. They want to have the ability to meet them in a flexible manner, but definitely more detailed than legal requirements. So Digital Operational Resilience Act, DORA, or the CRA, which we'll talk about today, are both examples of regulations that impact specific industries. The CRA is specific to software manufacturers and the software development industry. DORA is specifically managed by the European supervisory authorities that oversee the financial service sector in Europe. Mandatory, these are quite different in nature. So mandatory requirements define this minimum baseline that is required to operate within a certain industry. So they are very important to some that work in that industry that they may apply to. At the same time, they have absolutely zero bearing on others that don't operate in that industry or community. So PCI is a really great example of a mandatory requirement. If you're not familiar, back in 2006, the major payment brands, so Amex, Discover, MasterCard, Visa, all banded together to create this PCI Council to kind of uplift and better manage security risks associated with the payment ecosystem. And so they set out to define a set of standards that apply to anyone that accesses, processes, controls, or transmit payment card data. So again, they're called mandatory because they are mandatory to operate in an industry or provide a specific service offering. So if you don't meet PCI DSS or PCI SLC requirements, for example, you can be fined and actually no longer able to accept payment cards as a part of your business. Fourth tier is voluntary. So you can think of these as very broad cybersecurity frameworks. They're often viewed as kind of industry best practice because they are voluntary for adoption. They are not enforced. Organizations can actually use them as a framework to meet certain regulatory or legal requirements. Again, that's important because if you think of the level of detail, a legal or regulatory requirement may say you need a risk management framework to manage the security of software that's developed. They won't tell you how to do it, so you can use a framework to achieve certain regulatory or legal requirements. So if you think about ISO, OWASP, CIS, these are all accredited standards and framework bodies that issue best practice guidance. Again, the key word here is guidance because it is not mandatory or required. And then finally, you have advisory on the final end of the spectrum. These are kind of sources of cybersecurity guidance that are only informational in nature. So they're not structured like formal requirements or frameworks, but instead informational advisory. So if you follow CISA in the US, NCSC in the UK, ANISA in the EU on any social media accounts, you'll see that they post a number of alerts regularly, whether it be around new vulnerabilities, new threat actors, new attack campaigns. Again, these are not mandatory, they're just informational in nature. Now, as you can see, the first three drivers on the left are often which organizations tend to place the most focus on and invest the most and allocate the most resources to. That's because, again, they bear considerable consequence if they're not handled correctly or reacted to. And you'll often refer to these as LRM requirements, legal, regulatory, mandatory. And Fortune 500 organizations will have entire teams that are responsible for managing LRM compliance. So if you're going to spend any time digging deeper, understanding any of these in nature, I'd focus on those left three boxes. The remainder of the two are kind of there's no immediate consequences if not met or enforced. So if we continue down this concept of what we're talking about today, and Kadi introduced this driving analogy, the rules of the road are going to vary a bit when you're talking about what's considered best practice and what is actually a law or otherwise a mandatory obligation that you as a driver on the road must meet without exception. So on the left-hand side, we have best practices. Think of this as getting your oil changed in your car every 5,000 miles. If you go over that number, nothing is going to immediately happen, right? There's no immediate penalty or danger to others if you're at 6,000 miles, right? But as you let things drag on towards 10, 15, 20,000 miles, it's going to undoubtedly start to have some negative impact on your car, right? Think about reduced performance, decreased fuel economy, and then eventually engine failure. So you as a driver are not obligated to do anything, but there will eventually be some negative consequences if you put changing your oil out for long enough. You can think of the variety of best practice standards, frameworks, or other codes of practice that are listed here on the left that are related to software supply chain security in the exact same way. They are telling you proactive controls and proactive activities that you should be performing as a software developer to increase the security posture of the software you maintain, you publish, you interact with. But again, no one's overseeing you. No one's forcing you to do this. Now, there's a clear distinction between things you should do and things that you must do. So that takes us to the other end of the spectrum, these hard and fast requirements that I talked about before. Going back to the car analogy, you cannot drink and drive. You cannot drive without a seatbelt or drive without a license and insurance. The list goes on and on, right? And there are consequences that are enforced by an oversight body, by police officers, if those requirements are not met. You can get fined, you can go to jail, you can lose your license. Similarly, in the corporate world, as I talked about, there are also hard and fast obligation. The key here is, you'll see in a second, there are nuances. They are not all the same. Again, easiest way to remember the differences between these is LRM, legal, regulatory, mandatory. So hopefully that gives you a breadth of these kind of external influences that exist in the software supply chain. That begs the question, what does this mean to all of you in the room today? Again, it's going to ultimately depend on your role in the broader software supply chain ecosystem. And so for that reason, I wanted to continue our dissection of these roles that Katie brought up earlier and what they mean for compliance. Rather than taking my word for it, I've extracted references from an example regulation, in this case, as Katie mentioned, the Cyber Resilience Act, to support these claims, just to give you confidence. This isn't me just standing up on a soapbox here telling you what I think is important. This is backed by claims made by a regulatory body telling you to do so. So if you are a manufacturer of software or a downstream buyer of software who uses third-party products to operate a certain aspect of your business, tough luck. The majority of requirements are actually going to fall on your shoulders. We see that in all aspects of the CRA for a publisher, and we see other regulations like the Digital Operational Resilience Act for buyers, which says you need to test any commercial software package before you deploy it in your environment. For open source stewards, those of you would raise your hands, although you're not historically overseen by regulatory bodies, we have a new regime in the way of the CRA that does actually levy requirements against you. That being said, they are very light and tailor-made, and we'll kind of explore what that means in a second on the next slide. First, moving on to maintainers, you are broadly exempt from regulatory oversight as long as you are not monetarily benefiting from the commercial activity of software you maintain. And there's a number of conditions that I understand are still being defined by the European Commission as what does that actually entail, what does monetarily benefiting mean. But ultimately it comes down to, are you taking donations and are those donations being used to only cover certain aspects of design, development, and provisioning costs of software. And then luckily to anyone that raised their hand as a contributor, or an individual contributor, take a big sigh of relief. The CRA text very clearly says that you are free from any obligations as it relates to software security. Now, I must say, irrespective of kind of what hat you're wearing, what stakeholder you're responsible for, I think the overall impact of regulations like the CRA are going to be net positive. Because I think contrary to popular belief, the aim by regulators isn't simply to stifle innovation in the software manufacturing sector. It's ultimately to protect the end consumer by uplifting software supply chain security posture across the board. And yes, a lot of it will fall to manufacturers, but the truth is the large majority of commercial software that is sold on the open market today is actually made up of open source software. And I don't foresee that changing as a result of this regulation. I only expect more involvement, more collaboration, and more engagement from the private sector, who's now going to be heavily incentivized towards contributing to open source software to make it more secure at the end of the day, because it's their head on the line in front of the regulators. Now, because we see this fundamental shift in emerging requirements for this new stakeholder body that didn't exist before, wasn't recognized by a regulator before in open source stewards, I wanted to double click on what that entails. Because yes, the bad news is you do have obligations that are codified into regulatory text, which you can see on the screen here. The good news is that the bar that you're being held to is very, very low, especially when compared to manufacturers. So to put it into perspective, I included the screenshot from the CRA text. And these are the obligations of open source stewards, which is Article 24. The entirety of this only makes up 3 paragraphs of an otherwise 81-page regulatory text, so it's very small. Again, I have to reiterate, I am not a public policy professional or a lawyer, so take this with a bit of grain of salt. But I did want to use my audit and risk background to help translate these requirements into a much simpler language for you. So I did my best to put these into layman's terms and outline what do these 3 paragraphs that are outlined in Article 24 say you actually have to do as an open source steward. So first, very simply, write a policy, a Word document that describes your processes for secure development and vulnerability handling. Doesn't say you need to follow best practice guidance, doesn't say you need to achieve SALSA level 3 or something along those lines. Just have a document and make sure that the vulnerability handling section of that document covers at least a minimum of the sections that are listed. So how do you identify and document vulnerabilities? How do you address and remediate those vulnerabilities once you identify them? And then how do you report and share them with relevant stakeholders? Second thing you need to very simply do is cooperate. So make sure you work with your local regulator if they approach you and request that you engage with them. What does that mean? Well, in the text, they call it a few things that it may include. It could be something as simple as translating that policy document that's covered in number 1 to a language that they're familiar with and that they can easily read. Or it could be something more broad, like support the mitigation of a specific open source risk if they specifically identify it. And then third, finally, in the event that certain criteria are met, so for example, a critical severity incident in a system that a steward provides to support development, only then would you be required to assist in reporting the incident or vulnerability to a regulator. So at the national level, that would be to a designated CSIRT by the regulator. At the union level, that would be to a NISA or possibly even to the impacted users of that open source product. And in these certain edge case scenarios, you could be required to actually provide guidance on how to correct or mitigate the risk of that vulnerability or incident if it's severe enough. So again, have a policy, cooperate with authorities when required, and assist in reporting and mitigation in these edge case scenarios we kind of covered. So in summary, very light set of requirements, but that are now yours to meet as open source stewards. So with that being said, I think I'll pass back to Katie to talk about practice safety tips.
Thank you. All right, so when we talk about proactive safety tips, and just like we've been talking about this whole time, is that when you think about what you can do to protect yourself, is you have to think what lens you're looking at it from, right? Are you the maintainer? Are you the steward? Are you the contributor? Or are you, the producer? So some of these things, like Charlie said, they're best practices, and some, are definitely regulations. But easy examples that we can think of in continuing with this analogy is, one, get your headlights checked, right? It's an easy thing to do to make sure your car's working and you're not going to get a ticket when driving at night. So for that, it could be scan for secrets before commit, right? You want to make sure you're not leaking anything and it's in the best shape possible. Use your turn signals, or making sure you have clear SBOMs for downstream consumers. It's one of the easiest things you can do that will have a lot of value moving forward. Check your oil. We can think of this as regularly assess your dependencies. We know there's tons of them. There's tons and tons of them, but you want to make sure you're not dragging anything in that might contain malware, or maybe it is leaking a secret, or it might contain tampering. There's a variety of different things that could be happening in those dependencies you pull in, and you want to make sure that you're not using it, it's not exploitable, right? Watch your mirrors. In other words, monitor for malware in packages. I know we often, especially in this space, we talk about how vulnerabilities are, everybody's running around like a chicken with their head cut off, like trying to worry about that. But to be honest, any day that you have malware coming in, for me, would trump a vulnerability. And then lastly, enroll in defensive driving. And this is more about kind of embracing that DevSecOps culture where you're bringing all parts, all pieces of the puzzle who have a hand in this development process to the table so they can have some say. So that's bringing operations, security, and development professionals together to talk about these issues, to have plans in place that benefit not just one team, but everyone here, especially when they all have a hand in the thriving of these types of programs. So I wanted to kind of wrap up about everything we've talked about and kind of talk about how in a simplistic way, I did just talk through some of these, but I wanted to really list out what could be beneficial or proactive safety tips that each person can be using. I know that we kind of combine the first two as they're often the most regulated, but they are the ones who most likely will be audited. So creating an audit trail is also really important here. Charlie also had mentioned VEX and how it has a direct relationship between the two, and they're constantly communicating and collaborating between these first two groups. So it's really an incredible information sharing between the two parties. VEX is also strictly about exploitability, so that's also something we've talked a good bit about, where VEX Downstream provides that automation to customers and will help massively reduce the amount of manual triage time you'll need to do. So it's something you can implement. It's not always going to be easy, but it is something you can do that will make your life easier downstream.
I don't know if this is on. I actually forgot to speak about VEX before. For those who aren't familiar, VEX stands for Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange. It's a mechanism that would allow a publisher of software to communicate with a downstream consumer of software to say, yes, there is a component within my software package that is associated with a known vulnerability, but that vulnerability is not exploitable for one reason or another. Maybe it doesn't sit in the execution path, maybe the vulnerable code was removed. So that becomes very helpful in a Log4j style scenario where a manufacturer is being contacted by various enterprises to say, hey, do you have Log4j and am I impacted by this? So it's a really good communication mechanism, as Katie mentioned.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. So just to wrap up, for manufacturers, we know you're at the center of the CRA responsibility. So quick, easy things that you can do to start out is mapping your software supply chain. Know what you ship, know what's third party, and where it's coming from. Automating SBOM generation and vulnerability management into your CI/CD process. Also implementing secure by design principles. So these aren't things that are regulated necessary, but these are best practices. So things like strong default configs, encrypted communications, and secure update mechanisms. And lastly, I can't reiterate this one enough, is don't forget to document everything. You'll need a technical file and evidence for most of your secure development practices and the conformity of assessments. For contributors and maintainers, even though it's not directly applied to you, unless you're commercializing your work, you still play a crucial role, and you can start by having those best secure coding best practices now. Input validation, dependency hygiene, and helping create those reproducible builds. Be thoughtful about the dependencies you bring in. You're part of someone else's supply chain, so think about that. And then keep up your repos up to date, tag releases clearly, and provide change logs. Again, it really helps downstream users to meet their compliance needs. And who knows, because of some of this hygiene work that you are doing, it is more than likely going to make your package more used by other folks just because of the reporting aspect. And if it's possible, join communities that are working on secure tooling and guidance like the OpenSSF. For consumers, even though you're not fully subject to the CRA, expectations are shifting a good bit. So again, the times to ask about SBOMs, security update policies, build process. Really want to look to track and validate incoming software updates to make sure your org is applying those patches regularly. And then be cautious of software from unknown sources or projects with no clear maintainer. That's usually like a huge red flag. I know I'm not telling anyone anything new in this room, but if there's no clear maintainer, I wouldn't recommend using it. And then educate yourself and your procurement and legal team on what CRA compliance means when you are selecting vendors. For stewards, as we said, this one is a little bit more nuanced. You're not off the hook totally, but you are in a unique position to really raise the bar. So provide security guidance and templates for projects under your umbrella. So just kind of like OpenSSF and Linux Foundation does, there are, tons of different guidelines and best practices that you can use. The Salsa framework came from it. So now you have the chance to start participating in some of those programs or helping work to create them with other like-minded people. Help define what secure development looks like in your ecosystem. Help support the maintainers in meeting these goals. So people are a part of your ecosystem. give back and help them. It's only going to make them want to keep contributing into your system. And lastly, facilitate the conversation with legal and compliance experts. I know nobody wants to sit in compliance or a lawyer's office. It's kind of like being called to HR. You're like, not today. But really, this is only going to help prepare you for projects and communities for downstream adoption. So it's getting ahead of those questions that might be asked, or things that people might be interested in later on. So you're really just putting in that legwork now. And I know I said lastly before, but I really do have one more, is advocate for tooling, education, and funding for security work. I think this is often a missed piece, especially in the industry where, okay, we talk about the different like frameworks and stuff like that, but who's advocating for these different tooling or best practices and really that education? I see that education gap is fairly pretty large. Between talking with different customers or people I meet and then actually speaking with foundations who are like, oh no, it's widely used. And it's like, okay, it's widely used, but under what lens? So I think these are just some things we need to talk about. And if you're a steward, you have a really good opportunity to help educate folks on really what security means when it comes to your open source. So this is my last slide. So the rules ahead, right? Things are constantly changing in this space, and I think it's important that we really talk about how compliance really isn't a detour, it's more of a GPS, right? You need to think about it as like the TomTom you had back in the day that was on your dashboard, or even Waze or whatever GPS you're using now, but it's more of a guidance system to help you get where you need to go safely. The last article that Charlie brought up talks about security attestation, and the idea behind this is because maintainers, of free and open source software, that obligation comes from the CRA as a result of not having to achieve security markings, like, benchmarks. But I think this is creating a concept of security attestation that would allow a maintainer that's not obligated by a CRA to still support manufacturers in some way. So I just think that's an interesting, thought that kind of came out of this when we were looking through some of this. The other thing is the open source community is in a unique space right now to really build the way and be the leader for secure development. So it's something we can all participate in, and I think everybody should. If you have the time. Use free tools to help keep you safe, drive safe, code safer, and lastly, proactively demonstrate security to a manufacturer. And with that, thank you for those of you who sat through this with us today, and now we will take time for questions if there are any. Any questions?
And if a question comes to mind later, we'll be at the booth today and tomorrow, so feel free to drop by. Always happy to talk about regulation until you get tired of it. And I'm sure it's easy to get tired of quickly. So appreciate you guys all listening. And
yeah. Thank you so much. And for real, he really does love to talk about this stuff. So if anyone wants to discuss this,
or if you have any new hobbies that you want to pass along, so I don't have to be obsessed with regulation, I'm open to hearing that too.
Thank you.